Should old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should old acquaintance be forgot and never days of old lang syne? Happy New Year! Happy New Year!
Meow! Huples cat. As 2020 finally ends and we're looking forward to 2021, I think it's important to look back at history, to look back a long way in history. A very brief period in time for the Earth, but a really long period of time for a human. We have a very short lifespan. 1918-1919, the Spanish flu, so called because Spain was neutral in the First World War and had a free-ish press, and they covered the pandemic as it was raging, whereas us in the West and the Germans were not actually really covering it because they didn't want to upset people and divert them from the slaughter on the battlefields of Europe and elsewhere. Of course, that's one of the things governments do. But what the pandemic used to be called was the forgotten pandemic. The forgotten pandemic of 1918-1919. Very few people studied it. It was covered in epidemiology and virology with about as much interest as Black Death in the 14th century. People really didn't get to grips with the idea that we would have another pandemic within our lifetimes. Even people like Bill Gates, who tried to warn us and tried to say, look, this is distinctly possible. When you look at what they were saying, it's all kind of remote. People didn't really kind of get on board mentally with the fact we could have a pandemic. And of course some people still aren't. But before we do flush 2020 down to the toilet of history and we don't talk about it anymore, because hopefully by this time next year the majority of people in the rich parts of the world will be vaccinated, and the people who aren't vaccinated will have either had it and died or have long COVID or have long since recovered. We will need to remember some lessons. Now, one of the things I've said before and I'll say again is that unfortunately prepping is very retroactive and very in the now. So a lot of people are going to do a lot of videos telling you what you need to do to prep for the next pandemic. And the chance of the next pandemic coming before another SHTF is astonishingly small, I hope. We don't know. The future is unknown. But one of the things people are going to do, they're going to really stock a lot of N95s and gloves and hand sanitizer in their first aid kits and their emergency packs. Probably way more than they used to. But that's not the lesson of 2020. There's multiple lessons in 2020 and I want to discuss some of them in this video. I have spared you the full rendition of me and Kitty singing, our bad version of Auld Lang Syne. So I hope you also will grab a nice cup of tea, possibly a vegan snack, and sit back and watch. And do feel free to make some comments, you know, what have I missed, what am I exaggerating, what am I getting wrong? Because nobody's perfect, and I try to be, but I'm far from it. So before we say goodbye forever to 2020, before we all get vaccinated and we don't remember the pandemic because we don't want to remember it, people tend to blank out stuff like that. Or even worse, like the Second World War, they romanticize it. You know, the Blitz spirit in London? There was a lot of people who were severely mentally damaged by the Blitz in London. A lot of people were maimed for life. There was a lot of paraplegics. But we don't see them. What we see is the cheerful British housewives covered in dust in the rubble of the housing, drinking a cup of tea and cheering Mr. Churchill. History has a way of changing the reality of the people at the time. And we're having a lived reality of the pandemic, and we should try and remember what we are going to try and forget. So for me, the first thing is, like as most preppers, I've often told people you should have at least 3 months cash on hand for emergency use, a emergency amount of cash that you can take and spend in an emergency. Most economists and financial advisors also advise that you have 3 months of everyday living expenses in liquid cash or cashable assets available to you for short-term problems like sudden unemployment or sudden illness or a sudden fire in the house and you need to pay for a hotel for you and the dog and the kitty cats until such time as the insurance kicks in. You have insurance, right? And that's sound advice, and it's advice I think everybody should try to do, and it's not easy, especially if you're on a really tight budget or you have debt. So try and get rid of debt, try and save what you can, try and cover your living expenses. But we all got it wrong. In a slow collapse scenario, a slow, long evolving SHTF like a pandemic, what happened is that most people's cash reserves have long since been swallowed up. Certainly if you're relying on government charity, government redistribution of income, Some countries have done quite a great job of it for some parts of their population, like Canada, not all. And some parts of the world have done a really bad job for most of their population, except for the corporations. Anyway, enough of that. That is politics. That is ideology that's dictating who gets what help and how. And really in a pandemic, it's not a great idea because everybody needs to get enough help to obey and function lockdown restrictions for long enough to actually defeat the pandemic and or get vaccines that work.
This is the vaccine? It could be a beaker full of death.
So I'm going to change my point of view on that. I think you should have a year's worth of financial assets. Your net income, you should have a year's worth of your net income. Now everybody's going to go, no chance of that, right? And I realise that's a goal that's probably extremely lofty, but I think it's a goal that we need to do. What I used to do was I would save up my $5 and $10 bills in my change, throw them in a little safe, and then once every 3 months or so I would take them and buy them on prepping supplies or just treats for Kitty and myself. And that was wrong. What I needed to do was actually keep saving it for the actual SHTF. I had quite a bit of cash liquid assets, probably a lot more than most preppers. And I've nailed my way through most of it by buying stuff like in the April-May phase, and when I would go to Costco once or twice to get a lot of stocking in because we weren't sure how it was going to progress. And obviously a death rate of 15 to 25% of the people infected would probably crash society for a while.
Captain's log, stardate 2713.5. We have made an astonishing discovery. A planet which apparently is an exact duplicate of the Earth.
And thankfully we're nowhere near that death rate. But society has wobbled, there have been some shortages, and it was a good idea to have some cash on hand. But the economic use of that cash, I think, was what was escaping me and probably quite a few people. The ability to actually pay 3 months rent or 3 months mortgage if you were forced to without an income would be quite good if that didn't mean you also had no money for food. If you had money for food as well, that would be great. Because government assistance can be spotty, it can be removed, it may not be accessible. So that's one of the things I'm definitely saying. The lesson of this pandemic, the lesson of 2020, the more cash liquid assets you have, the better. You shouldn't have a hard level after which point you just spend it. That's what I had, that's what I did, and it was a mistake. The other lesson, it's a lesson I already assumed but didn't know, is that in most SHTFs, minor, mild or major, the majority of the urban population will not turn into rabid cannibals and start killing everybody and burning and looting as soon as it starts. A lot of people believe that. I didn't. I lived through the 2003 blackout in northeastern North America, and we did not get that in Toronto. We had people coming out on the streets, finding people with can openers because all the condo dwellers had electric can openers, and people having impromptu barbecues on the streets and generally being pleasant and helpful. People coming onto the streets as soon as the lights went out to direct traffic of their own volition out the downtown core so the suburbanites could get home on a pitch black summer's night with no lights at all. People generally are good. People generally will seek to work together to overcome adversity, or at least experience it communally. I have two neighbours. The one on this side's quite crazy, and I've done the odd video on her, and she has obviously got mental illness. And Ivy, can we resolve this?
Stay away from me.
Can we resolve this?
Stay away from my yard.
Can we resolve this?
Stay away
When we
from my
come
yard.
home from nights after 12 hours, it's really important we can drive into the driveway.
You have
How can we resolve this peacefully?
be a good neighbor.
How will
you
I
have
do
to
that?
Do it from day one. Respect my yard.
I am respecting your
Don't
right.
shuffle your snow onto my yard.
I can't help it when it's my yard as well. Do you want to show me exactly
You
where
are
your
lying.
boundary?
Stay away.
Do you not
Stay
have a
away.
deed? Do you not have a deed?
Stay away.
Do you
You
not
are
have
not
a deed?
supposed to be here. Get
Okay.
away.
Okay. If I see you again doing what you're doing, I will be reporting you to the police, okay?
If you do it again, I'll call the police. Her
response has been to hide, and that's great because I don't really like to interact with her. My neighbour on this side, I have a good relationship with him. He's a nice guy. He's been round a couple of times for drinks and some curried nuts, which he found quite interesting. And we don't have the same politics, but you know, it is a friendship because he's my neighbour and we talk, and he helps me out occasionally to change glass that's broken in window panes and stuff that I'm not good at, I've never done, and he'll come and help me and do it. They've been an absolute godsend in the SHTF, and we have for them, And that's the thing, the reciprocality of having a network is often overlooked. For example, I know that he will drive me to work if Kitty can't. I know that he will come in and feed the cats and the dogs if we can't arrange it. We haven't had to do either of those things, but it's nice to know that somebody cares enough that they would help. What they have done is they started to make us cranberry sauce. They made it for Thanksgiving because we didn't have any cranberries, and at that time there was a shortage of cranberries. There isn't now in Toronto, and they had loads of cranberries, and Lisa, the neighbour's wife, she made us a whole bunch of cranberries, and they offered to do it for us again for Christmas. And we didn't really need it for Christmas, but we said yes with gratitude. And I gave them a centerpiece of toilet roll for their family gathering, which they had, which I'm not really keen on family gatherings, but people interpret restrictions differently, and that's to be expected and to be understood. People aren't me, people are them. Our risk, because we both work in a hospital, is much worse than their risk. But we also provided N95s for them when they needed to go to hospital. He has a cardiac condition and he needs to go to hospital fairly frequently for check ECGs and other things. And he was able to take an N95 and use that. He was able to have hospital-approved sanitizer in the car. When he went shopping, he was able to get some surgical masks from us, not from the superstore, because they're probably not surgical masks. And his daughter, when she had to go to hospital, was able to go in with N95s as well. That sort of thing may have helped them avoid catching COVID-19. Probably it didn't. It was probably overkill. But the ability to help people out is a nice one. It makes you feel good, it makes them feel good. And I think we all know that now. There was a tradition in prepping of the lone wolf where people would say that, you know, being dependent on anybody is fatal. I think we all kind of get it. Not being dependent on anybody is a fatal error. As much as it sucked 2020, and trust me, it sucked, and it ain't finishing easily. Not for me in Toronto as a nurse. We're having a massive spike, way worse than we did in the spring, and it's still rising. But for me, the importance of friends, the importance of family, the importance of home has been cast ironly sorted out for me in my head and my heart during 2020. That's all for me. If you like this, please feel free to give me a sub and a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, please feel free to give me a thumbs down. But what I would like you to do is actually have a think in the comments section and actually write out what's the one blessing, the one lesson that you have got looking back on 2020 that you hope you will never forget. Toodles. This was a New Terrier production 2020.